You can't get enough Lincoln stuff.
Ed, just so you know, I think we're on Zoom now. Don't start yet, but I think people can listen in. So maybe we just.
Yeah, we'll start. I will stop with the
chit chat.
Okay. Thank you. We'd like to welcome everyone in our audience and our panel. Today we have a wonderful group lined up. Before we start, we want to hear some welcoming remarks from the president of the Middle East Institute, Paul Salem.
Thank you, Ambassador Gabriel, and welcome everybody to this session. This today marks the launch of an urgent policy memo that has been put together by an expert group working on the Lebanon issue here in Washington, D.C. And this has been the result of a fruitful collaboration between our own institute, the Middle East Institute here in Washington, D.C., the American Task Force for Lebanon, led by Ambassador Ed Gabriel and his team, with Jean Abinader and others on that from the ATFL group, and with the support and cooperation of LIFE, the Lebanese International Financial Executives, and we'll have Mr. Jacques Tome on the panel later today for that. This is a policy brief that we hope to use as engagement with the administration and the Hill, and we're certainly thrilled to have with us somebody from the Hill, but I'll let Ed introduce our good friend, Congressman LaHood. It's great to have everybody on this call today, and thank you for the panelists and the moderator for participating. Ed, back to you.
Thank you, Paul. And it's been a lot of fun working on this together. You know, I should say at the beginning of this, the release of the study couldn't come at a more important time, or maybe I should say a worse time. Right before our eyes this week, Lebanon is spiraling out of control. We have extreme poverty rates and unemployment rates exceeding 50%. And a soldier who was making $400 a year ago in lira, today, because of the devaluation, it's equal to $40 worth of lira, worth of dollars, which means they can't even feed their family when the inflation rate is so high. A piece of meat for 4 people is $50. So you can see how important today's session is. You'll get an in-depth understanding of the recommendations from the Middle East Institute and American Task Force on Lebanon from our distinguished panel, which will come up very soon. And Paul and I and our teams will be meeting with the Biden administration and members of Congress in the coming weeks to press these recommendations. Let me just underscore one point, and that is that the release of the document today represents an important consensus among more than 20 U.S. Lebanon experts, including former members of Congress and cabinet officials, former ambassadors and State Department officials, and think tank experts who have all come together and hopefully will demonstrate to the Lebanese people that they're not alone as they fight to take back their country and become a beacon for prosperity, peace, religious diversity, and democracy. So thank you very much for joining us. I'd now like to introduce Congressman Darren LaHood, who's among the strongest voices in Congress advocating for a democratic and prosperous Lebanon. Congressman LaHood is in his 4th term as congressman from the 18th District of Illinois, the same congressional district that Abraham Lincoln served in. He comes from a proud Lebanese American family and is the son of a former congressman and Treasury Secretary, Ray LaHood. His top committee assignments are Intelligence and Ways and Means, 2 very important committees, which is a testament to the high regard his colleagues have for him. Importantly, Darren is the co-chair, I should say, of the U.S. Lebanon Friendship Caucus, and he's championed many programs that aid the people of Lebanon, its educational institutions, and also the Lebanese Armed Forces. Darren, you're always there for us. This month, he's leading an effort to introduce a House resolution urging the administration to provide substantial funding for the Lebanese people at this critical time, in line with the recommendations you'll hear about today. So thank you, Congressman, for being with us today and spending a few minutes thank you.
Well, thank you, Ambassador Gabriel, for your leadership at ATFL. And Paul, thanks for everything that MEI is doing. And John, great to be on with you. And let me just acknowledge ATFL and Life and MEA for coming together on this important day to have this discussion and dialogue on the release of the second paper today. And it as you alluded to, Ambassador Gabriel, it couldn't come at a more important time. And I'm proud to be a member of Congress to represent Central Illinois, also proud to represent over 8,000 Lebanese families in my district. Many of them are first and second generation, and proud of my own Lebanese heritage and the trips that I've made to Lebanon. And Ed, as you alluded to, being the co-chair of the U.S.-Lebanon Friendship Caucus in the Congress has really been a rewarding part of my job, and look forward in this Congress to continue to be engaged. We're up to over 25 members of Congress across the political spectrum and country, and using the Lebanese Friendship Caucus to advocate for Lebanon at this important time. You know, there are so many existential threats against Lebanon right now. It is really an urgent inflection point. And so having this discussion and dialogue today and reviewing your proposal and paper that you put out with the 6 different points on how we stabilize Lebanon and advance U.S. foreign policy as it relates to Lebanon is more important now than ever. And so with that, I would just say that our relationship with Lebanon continues to be so vital and important, and reminding members of Congress and people in the administration the importance of having a vibrant, democratic, and independent Lebanon is in our U.S. foreign policy. But that takes advocacy, it takes education, and that's really what today is all about. And so in concert and complementing ATFL and MEI and Life, I look forward to being the strongest advocate possible in the Congress, along with my other members of the U.S. Lebanese Friendship Caucus. You mentioned a few of the challenges now facing Lebanon, COVID, the influence of Hezbollah, the challenges of working to form a new government, which has been extremely frustrating, the IMF and the economy, the civil unrest, and the continued rebuilding after the August explosion. But we must continue to persevere on behalf of Lebanon and remind people that they are a democratic ally in a very dangerous neighborhood in the Middle East. The longstanding U.S.-Lebanon relationship must continue. And U.S. support for the LAF is vital and continues to be important and sustain. And we need to make sure it's sustainable long-term. Support for the continued presence and financial support for UNIFIL and other forms of U.S. support through programs of ASHA and MIPA are vital to keeping Lebanon strong. Also supporting many of the NGOs that work outside of the government in Lebanon are important also. While there are certainly challenges facing Lebanon that we would like to see addressed in meaningful ways, including economic reforms, addressing public corruption, limiting the growing influence of Hezbollah, protecting an independent judiciary and freedom of the press, as well as a formation of a new cabinet and government that will serve the people of Lebanon in a transparent and democratic way. The Congress in the U.S. remains engaged in the partnership with Lebanon. I look forward to the discussion of the new policy proposals in your second paper today, Ed, and continuing to work with ATFL, MEI, IRI, and Life in my capacity as the co-chair of the U.S.-Lebanon Friendship Caucus. And the last thing that I would just say, Ed, we are at a grave time in Lebanon, and I don't think it's been lower since the end of the Civil War, probably, in terms of where we're at. But let's make sure this is the lowest point that we're at. It doesn't get lower than this, and use that as our goal moving forward. And so I look forward, again, to working with all of you. I thank you ATFL, MEI, and Life for putting this together, and look forward to being a working partner with you.
Thank you, Congressman, and thank you for your leadership, not only for the citizens of your district, but for the Lebanese American community. We couldn't be doing this without your leadership in Congress. Thank you so much. I'd like now to turn this over to our panel, moderated by Jean Abinader, the Policy Director at the American Task Force on Lebanon. Jean?
Thank you very much, Congressman LaHood. Thank you for your comments. And Paul, thank you for welcoming the group as well. We really appreciate this opportunity for all of you who have joined us, and we hope that today will help move the dialogue forward on what needs to be done by the United States government, by the American people to support Lebanon. We know, and we feel very strongly, that solutions to Lebanon's crisis can only be undertaken by the Lebanese people. But that doesn't mean that we, Lebanese abroad, Lebanese Americans, Lebanese from other countries, and the international community cannot participate in helping move Lebanon to, as Congressman LaHood said, a better place, to move them forward by convincing the political leadership and others that there have to be other alternatives. In our study, which is a companion piece to what we did this past July, we focused on 6 key recommendations. One is that the international community should literally, under the leadership and collaboration of the United States, say to the Lebanese leadership, time's up. You have to do something to support Lebanon. You have to make the changes necessary, and we're not going to change our minds. We have said reform before you get any funding. And so while the rest of us work on humanitarian relief and reconstruction relief directly to the street in Lebanon, to the people of Lebanon, it's really critical that the United States and the international community say to the political leadership, enough is enough. It's time for change. We're not going to help you until you help yourself. The second key that goes along with that is creating a direct assistance fund. The situation in Lebanon is so awful, and Jacques will certainly provide more data on this. There is no money in Lebanon for the common people. And so, as Ed said, inflation's out of control, unemployment's out of control. And so there's a time certain that we see the poverty rate rising now over 55%, that we see the need for the Lebanese to have a way out of this, a way forward. So we're talking about a direct action fund, which will then be used directly to the people until there is a government that can function. Working through NGOs, working through the international community, provide support to the Lebanese people concerning their humanitarian reconstruction efforts. So that also includes AUB and LAU, providing support for our American-style universities who have been such leaders in the country for so long, producing people who are well qualified and concerned with the future of the country. Our third concern, of course, has to be the LAF. The LAF to us is central to the integrity of the country of Lebanon. And as Ed pointed out, the troops are now being paid 10% of what they were being paid, roughly. And at the same time, this affects their operational readiness. If you can't have fuel, if you can't maintain your trucks, if you can't maintain your equipment, it affects the way in which the LAF can function. So we, as Congressman LaHood said, we want to provide as much support as we can to the LAF and mobilize our friends in Europe and in the Gulf to help bridge this gap in the financial needs that the LAF has in order to continue troop morale and operational stability. And Rhonda will have more comments on that as well. And then we talked about other things, about the importance of Lebanon becoming a showcase of democracy for the United States, because that's what the Biden administration cares about. They care about our fourth recommendation on economic reform, they care about democratic reform, and they care about ending corruption. And so those are our 3 latter points. And it's very important that none of these points be picked off in isolation. It really is a holistic approach to what Lebanon needs to move forward. We've given a lot of thought to this, and I especially want to thank people like Aram Nagurzian and Brian Katulis and Moni Yakubians, whose names are on the report, not as co-authors, but as people who helped enrich our understanding of how we can move forward in many ways. Bilal Saab contributed. You'll see the name as we're scrolling through the list here, that this is the study that we have up on the mirror now. If you want to see it, and if you want your own copy, just go to www.mei.edu or go to www.atfl.org. And both our websites after this program will have links to this. Wanted to bring up one other thing, how to participate in the program. Because we have an audience that's both Facebook and Zoom. For Zoom, go down to the Q&A section. At the bottom of your screen, you'll see Q&A. Just click on that and put your question in there, and we'll go to those questions. If you're on live stream, Facebook, go to events at mei.edu. So that's events at mei.edu if you have any questions you want to submit. So I think that's the housekeeping. I want to make sure that we have as much time as possible to have Q&A, because I know we have lots of interest in the country about Lebanon. And I want to encourage our participants on the panel to be as concise as they can in their remarks and to help us leave time so that we have a lot of discussion at the end. We have great people with us today, as you can see on the screen. We have Ron Deslim, we have Patricia Karam, we have Jacques Tome, and we have our own Paul Salem. So it's quite a group, very knowledgeable, and they have so much knowledge across the board about Lebanon that rather than have them confined to a 5-minute presentation on, what's going on with the LAF, we're going to have a discussion. So I'm going to pose questions to them. They will respond in turn to those questions, and then the others will be able to make their remarks on the response. So that way we'll have more of a discussion format than a presentation Q&A format. And then at the end, we'll have Q&A from the audience. So to begin the discussion, I of course want to go to our Zaim, Paul Salem. And Paul, looking at the broad picture of Lebanon today and the relationship with the United States, can you capsulize where we are and what we are faced with, both in Lebanon and in terms of U.S. policy toward Lebanon?
Thank you, Jean. I guess the point I want to emphasize is the issue of timing. We're all familiar with the problems of Lebanon and how they've become exacerbated since 2019 through 2020 and 2021. A collapse of the economic sort of sector, fiscal, banking, all of that, which has affected people's livelihood and increased poverty and unemployment, as has already been mentioned. A political crisis, which has a positive element to it, an uprising which started in October 2019 of a wide cross-section of the population who have been saying enough is enough for the last year and a half. And that political confrontation continues. A health crisis, of course, which has just made everything worse with the pandemic. And then the security crisis of the blast in the port of Beirut on August 4, the biggest peacetime blast ever. So we're all familiar with the very dire situation in Lebanon. I think what we are pointing to and the flag we are raising with this policy memo is the red flag that the Lebanese state is on the brink of real and full collapse. This is partly the result of all of these crises we've talked about. We've seen the head of the army and the head of the internal security forces last week raise the alarm that they can no longer function for very long. And we've seen even this week the failure of the president, the prime minister designate, the oligarchy or political class, whatever you want to call it, to make any progress in forming a government to begin to address these crises. In a way, we are in Lebanon today, although the conditions are very different. One might think back to January of 1975. One could think back to 1958 or other times when the state really was weeks away from actual physical collapse. What we say in the paper is the Lebanese state could take a few weeks to collapse fully, but will take maybe many years or even decades to put back together. Once the state fully collapses in Lebanon, which could happen in the next few months, the security situation is likely to deteriorate very rapidly. Local communities are likely to take up arms to sort of protect themselves, and we're likely soon to see a return possibly of ISIS and Al-Qaeda to areas they were pushed out of by the army just recently. We're likely to see a surge of refugees, both Syrians and Lebanese, leaving the country westward to Cyprus and Europe. Certainly, Hezbollah is the best prepared for such a situation and could even expand its influence. What we are saying in this paper is an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. As President Macron attempted several months ago to lead an international effort to pressure, to coax, to whatever it is that needs to be done to get a new government in place that's capable, that's clean, that's committed, and implements reforms so that Lebanon can have rapid talks with the IMF and the international community, have a quick sort of rescue package to stop the slide, and then enter into the longer negotiations to rebuild progress. This coincides with a new administration in the US, which favors diplomacy and has a number of very capable and able diplomats and wants to approach the Middle East and other parts of the world through a diplomatic problem-solving approach. We think that this new administration, by working with the Europeans and partners in the Gulf, but also being aware of adversaries, of people that the government in Iran, of the Russians, and that this administration understands the complexity of international politics. That this is an administration that can effectively lead an intensive diplomatic effort to get a Lebanese government shaped quickly, to move quickly on a rescue package, to stop the slide, and to avert the full collapse of the state, which once it happens, as I said, might take 1 or 2 decades to put back in place. And that's much more costly and much more difficult. Thank you, Jean.
Thank you, Paul. To follow up question on that, in terms of the Biden policy, which is seen so far, and to be fair, they're only, 70 or 80 days into their first year. Can we characterize that the Lebanon policy yet, or is it still something in formation? Or is it something that a lot of people raised a concern about, that it might be more of an adjunct to the Syria and Iran policy and Israeli policy rather than a Lebanon policy?
Well, as you say, it is very early days. The State Department is not at all fully staffed yet. A number of policies haven't really been reviewed intensively in any serious way. I would say there is an ongoing and very significant US policy, which is even a holdover from the last administration, that I think remains US policy, which is a very positive one. Support to the Lebanese Army, support to the Lebanese population and their current travails, a robust aid package, both to refugees, also to host communities, a position that the US is ready and willing to encourage the IMF and others for significant assistance to Lebanon on the condition that there is a government, as we've said, that is committed, that is implementing reforms and bringing actual change, that the US has said we're ready, and that the ball, in a sense, is in Beirut's court. So I would say that is the general policy. What we are calling for in a sense, it's not a change of policy. We are calling for a sense of urgency. As you said, the administration is busy with 100 things. Lebanon is a tiny country. We are not saying that Lebanon is a large country. We're not even saying that Lebanon has some huge strategic interest for the US. But we are highlighting the time issue, that if the US and the international community doesn't act quickly now, in March or April or May, by June or July or September or whatever, it might be too late, and you might have a fully failed state, as we have in Yemen, as we have in Libya, as we have in parts of Syria, as we had in Lebanon for 15 years between 1975 and 1990. So we're not calling necessarily for a change of policy, but a rising of urgency and priority, and to move quickly, maybe through a special envoy, or simply through the regular levers of US diplomacy with its friends around the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Any other comments from the rest of the panel? Just show me your hand and you can speak. No one wants to talk about current US policy or the state of Lebanon right at this point? Yes, no, cowards. Okay, I'll just go to Patricia, you're on next. And we're going to talk about the people of Lebanon. When we first started out this policy brief, we had to make a choice of what the priorities are. And for us, the number one priority is the people. What can we do to help? What can the United States do to help the people of Lebanon? The government, as we've seen, as Paul mentioned, in their reaction to the Macron initiative, in their meeting on Monday between President Own and the Prime Minister designate Hariri, in their actions across the board in dealing with civil society, we can see that their concern is not with the urgency that Paul is encouraging them. And so civil society to us, the people of Lebanon, is our number one priority. How do we help them? And as you know, the Lebanon Relief Project, which is being coordinated by ATFL, has been successful in mobilizing more than $40 million in medical assistance, humanitarian assistance, reconstruction assistance, in partnership with many, many NGOs here in the United States and in Lebanon. So at least we're doing that part on the humanitarian side. But Patricia, you just got back from Lebanon. What is going on? What's the tempo on the ground? What are people feeling? What are your impressions of Lebanon right now?
Jean, thank you very much, and thanks MEI and ATFL for inviting me. You will be happy with me because I actually had a comment to make in relationship to US policy, which I will make it just to preface my remarks. And some of it will be using different words, but reinforcing a little bit what Paul said without us coordinating. And I wanted to start by saying that, by underlining that really the US to date, while it has oscillated between sort of engaging and excluding Iranian allies, so to speak, it has really been involved in efforts at mitigating and not resolving the Lebanon crisis. That is to say that, in my view, in the past decades, and really since 2005, there hasn't really been a deliberate strategy at sort of charting a course on Lebanon to avoid the abyss. And I think the fact that we are in another mitigation stance is important because the situation, as Paul has underlined, is far worse today than it has ever been. And it will become even worse. So really a complementary approach to mitigation efforts has to be conceptualizing a strategy to save Lebanon, not just to stop Lebanon from sliding into the abyss. And again, from my perspective, looking at civil society and coming back from Lebanon, and there are many people on the call who are probably better placed to opine, or at least on the Zoom, who are calling in from Lebanon. A strategy really to save Lebanon has to consist of a multi-track approach to really helping empower and support civil society, but also new political actors and what I'm calling redeemable old political class forces. First, I mean, what is clear is from a remedial point of view, there are really nascent forces that have emerged post-October Revolution. And what we're really facing is the new reality of a society that has ascertained that the old discourse and the old confessional system are no longer valid and is trying to chart a new system or a path, but lacks the capacity. So we really need to help increase the potential of these new and emerging forces in this society and help them overcome their lacuna and chart their course. Second, in terms of corrective measures, what we have is we need to focus really on what I mentioned, salvaging the redeemable, for lack of a better word, or of better words. We really have a political class that is thoroughly corrupt and corroded by communitarianism, clientelism, dependency on the outside, and are determined to escape blame for having depleted the country's resources, financial culpability, criminal negligence for the blast. However, as toxic as this class has been, there are well-meaning elements within the structure for whom there needs to be a corrective path. And thirdly, proactive measures need to be taken into account, such that Lebanon of 2021 cannot be that of 1970, 1943, 1975, 1990, or even 2005. There are new realities, and I think these are realities where peace treaties with Israel are changing the face of the Middle East, where it's time for Iran to move out of exporting revolutions. This will really require strategic thinking on the part of the Lebanese so that the best interest of Lebanon and the region can be framed. For all three, and this is really, I mean, I'm getting to my point, Jean, the engines to make it happen is civil society. The wide-scale, spontaneous, leaderless protests that began in October really demonstrate the latent potential of civil society to unite citizens around concrete reforms. They also point to absences, gaps, the need for structured policy advocacy to mobilize more of the population. There's an overwhelming number of nascent post-revolutionary groups across the country that are calling for financial and political accountability. And these groups, these voices, they are operating right now on a more ad hoc basis, and their efforts are uncoordinated and often duplicated. These voices, however, will have increasing difficulty of mobilizing a citizenry that is becoming, and that's what the prevailing mood is like, in my opinion, that has grown frustrated, demoralized with a culture of impunity and worsening economic conditions. So one really has to keep in mind that the characters of the protests and the protesters is changing. Though the revolution of October was cross-sectional and had an overrepresentation of the middle class, now the protests are moving to underrepresentation of the middle class and overrepresentation of the poor and the destitute. And these proportions, changing proportions, are problematic because they're also indicative of an abandonment of the middle class, not of the protests, but of Lebanon. This middle class is not staying home, but leaving the country. And it's no longer about energizing the middle class, but in a way, rescuing it. The example of Tripoli is indicative because Tripoli has long been neglected, and the potential for revolts there to spiral to the destructive, again, echoing a bit what Paul said, are indicative of what comes next. Recently, protesters tried to burn, charge government institutions, which was a manifestation of anger at a situation that's deteriorating, as opposed to a protest to express hope. This means that violence will repeat itself and inevitably create a growing sense of despair across the nation. So again, at this juncture, I just want to emphasize before I close, Jean, if that's okay, how critically important is to continue to get money to the poor and straight to the poor until the crisis abates, and to continue to salvage efforts to help rebuild post-blast. And again, yesterday, the UN Food and Agriculture Organization and the WFP warned in a new report that they issued that acute hunger is set to soar in over 20 countries, which included Lebanon, which was cited as one of the acute food insecurity hotspots. Beyond immediate aid, subsistence, and reconstruction support, I think the focus really needs to be on the pro-democracy and pro-reform movement. But the outlook needs to be longer term. Unfortunately, the alternative to the political class cannot yet deliver, because many of the groups, as I mentioned, are redundant, uncoordinated, messaging incoherent, lacking policy solutions. So they're far from building the organizational structure and the get out to vote apparatus of more established sectarian groups. This is why I think we need to think ahead. And the pressing challenge is to enable and empower these independent voices within civil society to shift the political discourse and offer citizens and political leaders an alternative vision for Lebanon's future. And finally, I really think that we need to foster movements of thinking that will enable a new formula for Lebanon to take root, and one that isn't on the basis of which Lebanon has been operating. I think there needs to be a vision for Lebanon which sees for Lebanon a role in the region, as opposed to still living on the fumes of progress from the 60s, which don't apply anymore. And I'll stop there.
Well, Patricia, you raised a number of questions as well as some answers. One is, how can, and we're talking about the United States now, I'm talking about recommendations for US policy. One is, in that context, do you think the direct action fund that we're proposing can work? Are there vehicles, non-governmental vehicles, that we can mobilize or are already working in Lebanon, international as well as local, that can become sources of dispersion of aid to as broad a beneficiary body as possible, number one. Number two is, what can the United States and the international community do in terms of mobilizing civil society without appearing to be interfering? We don't want civil society people all at once being arrested because they become foreign agents. So how can we meet those two issues?
I think we need to be very careful. I think there are efforts already to kind of create funds that would be tapped by sort of, civil society groups that would be involved in the distribution of aid. But I do think that we need to consider that this situation in particular right now may not be resolved like through action through the political elite. For example, I'm thinking of controversies around, if you recall, the World Bank loan of $246 million to the government for a social safety net. The political class wanted the money distributed in Lebanese pounds at an exchange rate of 5,900 Lebanese pounds to the dollar, which is effectively 29% of the rates of the black market rate. So it would have been effectively haircutting the aid that's coming to the poor. So the World Bank pushed back, and now the central bank chief and the deputy prime minister sort of verbally agreed to distribute the aid in US dollars. This is indicative of what is happening and how the political class is trying to leverage even aid money to its advantage. So I don't know that there's an answer to this. I mean, I don't know that there's an answer to the disbursement of mechanisms, except that I know that certain agencies are giving it directly to civil society. The second question was on the issue of policy, how to support without appearing to interfere. Jean, I really think it's a question of approach. I think we need a humble approach, and we need to see ourselves as enabling and building capacity as opposed to kind of interfering. IRI has been doing some work around this very humble work around the multi-track approach, but we really see ourselves as sort of enabling of efforts that are already underway and kind of capacity builders. You encounter the accusations, but it has to be clear where we're coming from. I think it's important for the US to be involved, and I think the pro-democracy movement needs support.
Paul, you were deeply involved in the last election, and we make a point in the paper of talking specifically about making sure the 2022 election happens for parliament and then for the presidency. You've been watching this very closely, I know. What do you think is possible in terms of what Patricia and I were just discussing about enabling civil society and the political street to take advantage of a common despair that's going on and turn that into mobilization?
Thank you, Jean. I mean, I'll be very brief because I do want to hear from Randa and Jacques on their thoughts, but just a few thoughts that, first of all, I think the civil society movement and the attempts to prepare for the elections, the parliamentary elections, are obviously a Lebanese challenge. The Lebanese civil society movements are very, very intensively busy and trying to organize. I don't think that, of course, they should be encouraged and supported, but that's not the critical element. They will, I think, succeed or fail, which is correct, on their efforts and how it plays out in Lebanon. So I don't think they are waiting for some handout or some support. I think if we focus that the international community helps the people, helps the poor, and let the civil society and pro-democracy, pro-reform movement take shape. The worry, of course, like many Arab Spring countries, is that the dynamics which lead to successful protest are different than the dynamics which lead to a successful election campaign. And that's where we are today. The groups are well aware of it. It's still not the case that despite the great displeasure with the ruling class, enormous displeasure, that does not, unfortunately, translate automatically into an automatic change in voting behavior if and when elections are held. The pro-democracy movement, obviously, the more it can unify, the better. The more it can put forward for elections and for leadership more leaders. Being leaderless is nice and useful for a protest movement, but if at the end of the day people need to vote, they need to vote for somebody. And that really isn't yet happening. You remind of a very important point that we have in the paper, that the US and the international community must absolutely insist that elections take place, parliamentary elections take place on time in the spring of 2022, a year from now, and they must not be postponed. We must not forget that in Lebanon, parliament is the supreme power. It elects the president, it names the prime minister, it elects the speaker of parliament. So parliament is really critical. We must also not forget that the term of the current president ends in the fall of 2022, so next year as well. So 2022 is a very, very important political year, but Lebanon might not last that long. And hence what we're emphasizing in this paper is immediate action to take Lebanon out of the intensive care unit. Okay, maybe it's just going to go back to the hospital room, but we need to get it off the ventilator and save the life first. And then we can work on the other things later in this year and hopefully in 2022. Thank you, John.
Thank you, Paul. It's unfortunately a very good metaphor. And this leads us right into our next speaker, Jacques Tome. Jacques has been very, very helpful with his colleagues in providing us really good economic analyses, financial analyses of what's going on in Lebanon. But as we worked on the brief, we decided to, rather than restate a number of the issues we raised in our previous paper, which was 20 pages, since we're only going to have a 4-page paper, that we would leave it as background information that we can make available when we need to. And so, but I would be remiss if I didn't thank Life for all the work that they have done for us. But Jacques, one of the cynical remarks made by some people, including our friend Rhonda, was that the level of poverty in Lebanon makes it easier for the elite to buy their votes. It's much cheaper to buy their votes now because the people are poor. Can you give us a good capsule of where Lebanon is right now and what you think are the major challenges facing the people as well as the institutions in Lebanon?
Yep, sure. Thank you, Jean. And yeah, look, I'm here on behalf of, for those who don't know, Lebanese International Finance Executives, otherwise known as LIFE. So we're very happy to be a partner with MEI and ATFL on the new program. And we've been working on this for 2 years, and I've known Ed and Paul for years, so it's a pleasure. I mean, look, the political disincentives for them to save the economy are bad. And I mean, maybe you could argue it's a short-term disincentive, which you're alluding to and Rhonda has. And that's, yeah, I mean, they're sort of trying to, it's self-preservation. They're trying to survive. They've enriched themselves quite a lot, and they're trying to preserve that power and financial position. It's horrible when you think about it. At the end of the day, I think the biggest problem is that people don't have money. And So whether it's the 70-year-old doctor who came back from Dubai after 40 years, or a student who relies on their older sister's remittances from the US, or someone who's just lived in a village in agriculture their whole lives, that they can't access their money to do basic things. So that's going to drive people a bit more to the edges and crazier. Our view is that in the short term, without, obviously we need wholesale corruption and political reform to enact, whether it's the IMF's program from 2019, which is a really good program. I've answered in the Q&A that McKinsey has a great economic vision for Lebanon, and both those programs have short and long-term solutions, rapid responses, and plans on top of that. But the first thing they have to do is protect the reserves in the banks. I mean, the government has essentially stolen the money by lending to itself and then spending it on subsidies and an oversized government. So, but they still have some reserves. So even if you have $200 of debt and $20 in your pocket, you still have $20 in your pocket, and you should use it wisely. And right now they're burning it on subsidies, and we have talked about an immediate subsidy reform and replacing it with a targeted transfer program that can have international support, and that doesn't require the wholesale changes required for a solution. So we have to protect the very, very little reserves that are left before there's really no money, and then you have a security issue as well as a financial issue. And the other point I think we'll make very briefly, I mean, talk in our paper, point 4 is about mobilizing the already very well-baked IMF program. We don't think it needs any improvement. We don't actually think the IMF itself needs any encouragement. The Lebanon has to go to the table. Us as diaspora, as organization, cannot negotiate on behalf. But I think that the important point I'll leave for everyone is that we're not for a meltdown. I mean, we are in a meltdown. This is worse than Venezuela. This is worse than Argentina. It's an economic version of Rwanda. People are going to keep leaving. And this is worse than in many ways, this is worse than the horrible bloody civil war from 1975 to 1990. In that war, there was plenty of money. People were looked after in a way, right? And you didn't have this humanitarian crisis. It was a very violent, international incident that, like World War I, just continued when people thought it would end. But this is potentially worse, and the political disincentive to fix it is really horrible. And right now, you're right. I mean, they can kind of muddy along. Now, there might be a mix of political disincentive and delusions at work, and I think maybe delusionally they think they can muddy along for a few years, and no one knows if it's a few months or a few years. But I think the important thing with the paper is the urgency. We're in a meltdown. It's, in our opinion, we're Argentina and Venezuela, and it's already too late. So that's life's economic view.
In terms of, thank you very much for that, Jacques, but in terms of the economy, there has always been in Lebanon an informal economy that is almost larger than the formal economy. So that when you get figures like unemployment figures, or when you get per capita income, or when you get GDP, it's not really the picture of Lebanon. For example, for so long it was artificially inflated on the banks, for example, how much resources they had. So Lebanon had a $30 billion GDP and on a functioning economy of $6 billion. So how do we find out how we can move forward? For example, today, if you were going, and I think Patricia made a really good point about Tripoli. Tripoli was once the industrial heart of Lebanon. It's not considered the poorest area of Lebanon. It's got its own economic issue, it's got security issues, it's got community issues. One of the things that people keep talking about as a potential solution, and again, this gets back to US policy because of recommendations that we can make, is decentralization. I think part of that is because of the notion is that decentralization is somehow going to empower local officials and municipalities to create their own destiny or to control their own destiny. And yet we know from experience in so many other countries, the decentralization only works if those people not only have the power and the budgets, but know how to do it. In other words, it's not just another way to spread corruption. And I'm sure you've heard lots of ideas about how to approach the economic issues. Given, as you said, the urgency of the economy right now, what are some short-term, immediate steps that can be taken to help the people of Lebanon?
Well, I think, yeah, so I mean, when you say decentralization, you could talk political or economic, and unfortunately, without taking a position on the issue, there's a lot of growing support, and I hear this in London, in the US, among the diaspora, and of course in country, for decentralization. And that could happen, it will not happen in an organized manner if it's going to happen in the near term. So that's the bigger downside in our view, rather than how it's administered. Yeah, I think the most immediate thing is you stop the subsidies, and the international community can replace it with a targeted cash transfer system. Many people are dependent on the subsidies. However, it is going to end the Lebanese bank. The bank sector has already ended, but it will accelerate its death, and therefore increase the risk of war and violence. So the sooner you can get off the subsidy system and replace it, something that has a temporary international support bridge, that's the most immediate thing to answer your question. But the subsidies are not a substitute for reform, but they're part of the larger problem, and that is the country has actually not a real economy. You talk about the construct of the economy, and it's supported by a 4-to-1 diaspora. It gets compared often to Ireland and Hong Kong, given its small size, small territory, limited natural resources, and very large diaspora. And those have good, knowledge-based economic models for the future. But in the interim, how you get there is you have to shrink the current deficit is unsustainable. The government spending is unsustainable. There's too many people on the payroll, and they're not doing anything. I mean, Tripoli has the amount of people that get employed in the labor ministry, for example, and sit around do nothing all day. That's not sustainable. That is part of a political corrupt agreement by parties to share whatever is left of reserves and the tax and the deficit. So I think you would cut down on the subsidies, and over time the ministries, and rebalance to a knowledge-based economy. But that's the longer-term economic vision, which I put in the Q&A, the link. We like the McKinsey vision, and of course at Life, lots of literature and writing on this. But in the short term, the international community, while they should not at all subsidize or reward this current government or governments like it, they can help with targeted cash transfer to help the really poor Lebanese, who are, to no fault of their own, dependent on a political system of subsidies that are inherently unfair and will wreck the country sooner rather than later.
Thanks, Jacques. It's very, very helpful. And I think it feeds right into Rhonda's questions, or answers, I should say, that she has on the impact on people in terms of security. You just mentioned that if the economy continues to decline, it creates a security issue, not just food security, but actual security itself. And so, Rhonda, it's a big question. One is about civil strife, potential for civil strife, and secondly, or whichever way you want to handle it, what's going to be going on with the LAF with regard to security issues, internal.
Thank you, Jean, and good to be with you, Paul, Patricia, and Jacques. Let me start with the LAF and with the March 8 comments by the commander of the LAF, which was really a departure from the tradition of the Lebanese military of not giving public commentary on political affairs. And there are drivers for these comments. So one of the drivers is the economic conditions and the impact it has been having on the army, operational readiness and others. As he put it, they have been, because of the economic condition, the army embarked on its own austerity plans, but at the same time has been trying to negotiate with the civilian officials some remedies to these to some of the economic difficulties that the army facing. And as he put it in his remarks, nobody is really responding. And he ended up by asking them, do you really want an army? And I think that's a good question. Do these politicians want an army? And especially, do some groups in Lebanon want an army? And that's a question that is up there, and I think it's something that is important to point, especially as part of the recommendation, that this army needs major support going forward. It's not only in materiel and weaponry, but in economic support, And I think the report has a good recommendation in terms of this emergency fund, targeting to help soldiers and their families survive this economic condition. That's one reason or one driver of the commander's comments on March 8th. The second driver is increasing interference by the president and his political allies in terms of appointing senior officials in the Lebanese armies of their choice. And in particular, one particular case, recent case, has been the Directorate of Military Intelligence. The former head is somebody that General Aoun, General Joseph Aoun, felt comfortable working with, and there has been a push by Babda and by Hezbollah to appoint somebody else to the head of that position. And that's part also of the frustration, or what drove the frustration and the comments on March 8th. But the third factor is this increasing realization by the army leadership of attempts by political parties, particularly the FPM, Aoun's party, and Hezbollah and others, to drag the army into military confrontation with the people. And by doing that, really undermining the kind of public support that the army has been cultivating, the position of neutrality. And so you saw on March 8th, an order issued by the Lebanese president calling on the army to open the roadblocks by force. Last Thursday, we saw Hezbollah Secretary General, Mr. Nasrallah, in his speech saying this is one of the functions to be performed by the army, which is to open the roadblocks by force. And this testing of the army and trying to push it more into confrontation with the population, in my opinion, is going to increase by the political parties, partly diversionary tactic by them to get the people and the population to focus on, oh, look what the army is doing, look at the violence between the army and the protester, instead away, focus the attention, divert the attention away from their, dismal record of governing, away from the political paralysis, away from the economic conditions. And that's something that I think is going to create more, in my opinion, dilemma for the army and for the army leadership going forward. And as I said, this testing will increase going forward. Now, we have talked about the impact on the army, the impact of the economic condition on the army. I think we can talk of three levels of impact. One level is definitely the impact on operational readiness, but and that's not only with the army, but also with the ISF, the Internal Security Forces. Let me share with you a quick statistic based on information from the ISF. According to ISF statistics, incidents of homicide and theft in Lebanon increased by 45.5% and 144% respectively, year on year in January and February of 2021. And this kind of violence is also going to increase as more people join the hunger rolls, as more people grow desperate for the lack of job opportunities, for the dismal economic condition. That's one impact on is their operational readiness. The other impact, and there has been talk about it in the press, is the morale. After all, a soldier who cannot, because of, as you said earlier, of a depreciation of the lira, cannot feed his family, I think is going to affect his performance. So there is an increase worry and concerns within the army senior leadership ranks of the impact of the economic conditions on the morale. And hence this recommendation in the report of an emergency fund, not to buy materiel and weapons, but also to help soldiers' families buy food, buy medicines, buy gasoline, buy diesel fuel. And that's something, and there are a number of ideas being floated around of what kind of mechanisms could be put in place. But I think my recommendation would be, again, like with the World Bank, is as much as possible, or is try to avoid going through government institutions or through, for example, the Ministry of Finance, for the fear that some of this funding will be haircut, by the political elite. And the third level of impact, which I see of the economic condition, but also of the political condition, is this impact on the relationship between the civil and the military, and also between the population and the army. And again, this is going so the army will need going forward to tread really a fine line between maintaining security and order on one hand, while protecting protesters' rights. And I have to say that since 2019, the record of the army in terms of protecting human rights and protecting protesters' rights has been mixed, So on one hand, people say, well, they have been even-handed in dealing with the protesters. On the other hand, we have seen recently, especially after the port blast and the protest following that, pictures of soldiers being violent in their dealings with the protesters. We have also 2 days ago, seen the report from Amnesty International talking of military intelligence directorate using torture in interrogations of Syrian refugees who are, charged for counter-terror activities, including minors. So there is work to be done by the army, and I think the army leadership is cognizant that they have some institutional capacity issues in terms of dealing and protecting human rights. And I think this is where also American US-funded training programs, educational programs can help in terms of the doctrine and reinforcing this aspect of civilian protection in the doctrine of the Lebanese army, in the behavior of the soldiers. But I think going forward is the second most important thing is going to be addressing the economic needs and of the soldiers, maintaining morale. And again, here I'm repeating myself, really succeeding in tests that they are going to be put in terms of not getting dragged in violent confrontation with the population, and by doing so, losing the support. I mean, based on the Arab Barometer in 2019, the credibility that the Lebanese army enjoys compared to all other security institutions, including the ISF and the Directorate of General Security, is extremely high. I mean, you are talking about, I think, 80% compared to 40%. And so being the only national institution that's still trusted by the majority of the population to maintain internal security, I think it's important not only for us to support it, but also for the army leadership for us to understand the kind of balancing act, that the Lebanese army leadership needs to tread in the coming month and year.
Thank you very much, Rhonda. What is your feeling, going back to Jacques' presentation, that there will be more inter-community strife as the poverty level goes up? Are people going to start finding each other scapegoats? Are they going to be, people are, videos of people fighting in supermarkets. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about really devolving the society back into warring groups or more civil conflict. Do you see that as emerging or is increasing?
Yeah, I think the first worry I will have is about Syrian refugees. What's going to happen to them? I think as conditions worsen, economic conditions worsen, and especially if Syrian refugees are being paid in dollars, their cash assistance is being given in dollars. I think they might become the target of some of the violence at the local level, scapegoating them. And so we have seen that in the past. We might see that on the increase going forward. The second, I think, I think Paul mentioned that, is that the fear is that once the state collapses, and it will collapse, in the next few months, if these conditions are not mitigated, and it doesn't look like, I'm not very optimistic about these conditions being mitigated, then you are going to see more communities resorting to self-protection. And when this happens, then there is a likelihood of intercommunal strife. However, on one hand, everybody says that, oh, everybody has weapons, but really the only actor that has weapon outside the army, and in fact more than the army does, is Hezbollah. And so in terms of warnings of major civil war and all of this, I've always been of the opinion that there will be a civil war in Lebanon if Hezbollah wants a civil war. And so far, all the indications say that Hezbollah does not see a civil war in its interest. There will be an increase in intercommunal strife. There will be increase in homicide and, in thefts. Yes, that's a reflection of the deterioration in the economic condition and increased desperation of people. But the kind of large-scale civil war that we have seen, 1975 through the late 80s, I think right now that I don't see those conditions being there.
I hope you're right. Okay, we're going to go to questions and answers in a moment, but I wanted to give the panelists a more opportunity to make any comments they want to kind of summarize or to introduce something we haven't talked about, and then we'll go to the Q&A.
Can I follow up Rhonda's point? I mean,
yes, please.
And so I'm speaking out of my lane on security, but I'll broaden it to economic. I mean, what you're saying is correct, but if a non-Hezbollah party went to health, I mean, I guess the point is, as John said, the deterioration of the population sadly creates political disincentives and opportunities for the current political class. Doesn't that also create opportunities for international actors who have been weakened in Lebanon over the last 15 years, specifically the Arabs? I mean, would Saudi Arabia hesitate to arm a non-Hezbollah actor who flew over and asked for arms? I mean, it could take 2 weeks to build up enough to cause trouble. I mean, it doesn't have to happen now, and you don't need to really do that much planning, to be honest. We know that, and then you can expand that opportunism to just other things, obviously money and strife and decentralization. But I guess since we're talking about security, how have you seen that?
You know what? I mean, so far, there have been some attempts in the past at creating this anti-Hezbollah force within the Sunni community. And we have not seen those attempts succeed. So we know that there have been attempts, especially around when Mr. Hariri was detained in Saudi Arabia. This was done in parallel with ongoing attempts at the time to create an anti-Hezbollah force, especially based in Tripoli, because again, it's a poorest community, it's a Sunni community. There is a lot in it of fighters who were in Syria, Lebanese fighters who were in Syria, came back. And so there is a lot of know-how. And so with the right leadership, enough money, maybe you can create an anti-Hezbollah Sunni force. Yes, it's possible. I still think I don't see that happen I mean, you can have this small force, but I don't think it's the kind of force that's going to be able to threaten Hezbollah's military status. I think, given, again, the weaponry, the know-how, the expertise, the track record. However, what I might think happen, and Mr. Nasrallah referred to that in his speech on Thursday, and I don't think many people really, tuned or focused too much on what he said. And it reminds me of May 2008. So let's look at what happened in May 2008. Hezbollah at the time decided to send these, thugs, in my opinion, into West Beirut to force or to reverse a decision made by the cabinet at the time, but also to change the political dynamics on the ground, and then eventually going to Doha and the election and all of this. I think at some point they might realize that these political dynamics need to be changed by some kind of forceful act. However, the dynamics regionally today are different from in 2008. Remember, in 2008, you had the Bush administration, you had a lot of the Sunni Islamist street, anti-Bush, anti-the US, and the Lebanese government at the time was seen as pro-US. And so Hezbollah went into the street against a Sunni majority city, knowing fully well it's not going to have the kind of regional reverberations because, as I said, of the geopolitical dynamics at the time. Today, Hezbollah faces, after the Syrian war and its intervention in Syria, Hezbollah faces a totally different geopolitical situation. And that factor will be weighed in their calculus of whether they can mount this quick, short-term operation leading basically to changing political dynamic and forcing everybody to come together to form a government and eventually, come to a deal, a Doha 2 or some kind of a deal. And so that is more likely. And that operation, again, given the anger, given in Lebanon, given the geopolitical condition, given the Sunni Shia, emotionally charged relationship throughout the region, not only in Lebanon, I think there is this fear of this then degenerating into some kind of a much wider scale violence. And that will be a factor that, in my opinion, Hezbollah will be taken into consideration in deciding whether they need to, they should do this kind of operation or not.
That brings us to a point that's the questions, several questions that have been asked. I was looking at the screen. And Paul, you might want to kick off an answer to this, and that is, it's a point we mentioned earlier, a Lebanon policy versus an Iran policy. In other words, is Lebanon going to be a bargaining chip in the Iran negotiations or in Syria negotiations, or how do you see that? I'd like all of you to respond, but Paul, if you could kick it off. How do you see the US administration now, a sense of priorities in the region right now?
Yeah, a very good question. Let me first, I want to sort of emphasize and build a bit on what Renda said and what we say in the paper, and really to distinguish between state collapse and what happens and the different dynamic of civil war, which is a different thing. And I agree with Renda that we're not on the brink of a civil war. The dynamics are not there. Nobody wants a civil war. We are on the brink of state collapse and what you might call civil, and obviously civil chaos, civil conflict on a small scale as communities simply arm themselves. It was interesting that even in the corona pandemic, a lot of communities took charge of their communities in order to prevent people from coming and going, and there were problems for Syrian refugees and so on. So we're on the brink of that kind of collapse of the state and localization of security, which will, yes, create conflicts here and there, but we're not on the brink of a civil war in any major sense. Maybe that's the one small thing. On the interconnection, well, the fact of the matter is that Lebanese decision-making is penetrated hugely, certainly by Iranian decision-making. I would say it used to be penetrated quite considerably by Saudi Arabia or other Gulf players, but much, much less so now, and nothing to compare with the Iranian presence and the Iranian interest. Most of the Gulf has given up on Lebanon, fed up, has no real game that they're playing there. This Biden administration obviously is going to engage or trying to engage with Iran on a track to get back to the nuclear deal, and then to engage on reinforcing the nuclear deal, talking about their missile systems, and talking about Iran's regional militia or proxy presence in the Middle East, which would include Lebanon. So yes, I think Lebanon, is part of this knot, part of this interaction between the region and Lebanon. It might be the case, that Hezbollah and so on is waiting, maybe with indications from Iran. Love to hear what Enda thinks about this. That it's not the time is not yet ready to make the deal in Lebanon because we don't know what's on offer for the Iranians. And if the Iranians want to encourage Hezbollah or the Houthis or others in other places, they need to know what's in it for them, what's the deal. So sadly, yes, I think this process of trying to move the domestic front forward, sadly, is dependent and greatly penetrated by one major player, Iran. Some people bemoan that Riyadh and Abu Dhabi and other are not that interested in Lebanon. And indeed, they're not major players currently today. What we are trying to do with our paper is to say to the US administration, we understand you have all kinds of priorities and issues. Of course, Iran is one of them. But we are saying Lebanon requires urgent, immediate attention and needs to be understood to some degree on its own terms. We are also aware that the Biden administration might be able to make progress where a Trump administration couldn't. We are aware of that because we know they'll be talking to the Iranians, and that if there is some major obstacle, they will be aware of it and they might be able to help resolve it. At the end of the day, Hezbollah, this major armed group which operates as a wild state within the state, is the huge problem for Lebanon. But it's also sadly the case that it's not going to disappear this year or next year, and that whatever government is put in place, and we need a government, is going, that it's going to be within the reality that they're in, what we are in now, maybe with some improvements, but we can't afford to wait until that day when Hezbollah no longer exists or dissolves into the Lebanese Army. Those are longer term solutions, and we don't have time for it now. So I would say yes, to some degree, Lebanon will be connected to particularly the talks with Iran, but that might also provide an avenue to at least get some progress in Lebanon.
Related to Jacques, I wanted to ask you a question. There seems to be an assumption that if Lebanon does X, Y, and Z, that somehow international investors will come pouring in. Given what Paul's just said about the long-term presence of Hezbollah, unless something else happens, if you were an international investor, and I know you're in that position of looking at Lebanon, what are the conditions that could be supported by the United States and the Europeans and others that would encourage you to invest in Lebanon? What are the keys to turning your vision around from this unstable place that has all this Iranian influence to something that I can make money in, besides real estate?
Yes, and I'll try to also answer a few of the questions in the Q&A. I've been typing some answers, but
Right. Can you move a little closer to the mic, Jacques?
yeah, so sorry, I'm saying I'll try to answer some of the Q&A questions as well in answering your question. And I've also been typing some answers, but basically the most immediate, and people have asked about concrete steps, is I think you have to get off the subsidy system and replace it with direct cash transfers. And the international community, through our paper recommends a direct assistance fund, can do that. The US can do it on its own. A lot of people can do that. What that will do is preserve whatever last remaining reserves are in the bank. If there's some certainty around the remaining reserves in the bank, and again, the analogy is you have $20 in your right pocket and a credit card bill past due for $200 in your left pocket, you could still do something with your $20 to buy time. And rather than just continuing the subsidies, replace that with the international community, then you can stabilize the currency. Some people have talked about a currency board, but anything that creates some stability or certainty around banking reserves and currency is the first step. And then from there, you might not get the savvy funds of London and Geneva, New York, but you might get some Lebanese diaspora Gulf investors coming back in and providing hard currency and potentially productive capital into the economy. And maybe they sense opportunities in terms of lower asset values and lower wage values to rebuild from there. But I think without a stable currency and if the subsidies continue and operate, what's left in the banking sector, forget it. There's no one will invest. So that's a concrete step you can take today without wholesale reform.
Yeah, I've noticed in the past that what we're going to be doing initially, I think, is really relying on the Gulf to come in and help Lebanon, because they're the only one that really sees the situation. And of course, Lebanese abroad see the situation. I want to, as we continue to answer questions, I didn't want to miss the opportunity to encourage you to tune in tomorrow to the MEI webinar on Lebanon's financial meltdown and the prospects for recovery. That's tomorrow at 10 a.m. with Alain Bifani, Huri Shaul, Henri Shaul, Nasser Saidi, and Haneen Syed. And of course, Chris will be moderating tomorrow. But if you want to do back-to-back all the Lebanon you ever wanted to eat, this is today and tomorrow. Through MEI are the ways to go to that. Some other questions we're getting. We're getting the credibility questions about the leadership. Can they ever do anything that will restore trust with the people? But one of the questions I think that fits into the economic one, but also the humanitarian one, is the diversion of aid that's going into Lebanon. It's being diverted. They're finding subsidized products all over the world that are Lebanese products that are being smuggled out of the country. So the smuggling issue is a big issue. The diversion of humanitarian assistance. As Patricia brought up, which I thought was an excellent point, that most people don't really know about, is the attempt by the government to divert a large part of World Bank assistance by just changing currency fluctuation, having it favor them instead of going to the people. But there's a complicated set of interrelationships here. And how do we build trust, build credibility? And going back to Jacques' point, lots of people talked about cash transfers, and there's certainly a lot of experience in the world on providing people with literally credit cards that they can go in and use. But if they're not denominated in dollars, then the cash transfer system's already a loss when people get them. So how can we, as the United States, as the international community, move to help the Lebanese people and NGOs and civil society stem the hemorrhaging that's going on right now in terms of the quality of life of people in Lebanon and the services they get? Patricia, you want to take a shot at that?
Well, I mean, others may have more specific sort of responses to that, but I sort of want to reinforce the point, and I've been thinking about this in the question and answer session, that it's hard to imagine a solution. The situation is so dire beyond the immediate sort of needs that everyone has highlighted. To me, there is a combination of things that need to broadly happen. One, there needs to be an effort to bolster sort of internally led forces, new forces for the new energetic civil society forces that are emerging. And there needs to be also support from the outside to kind of influence whatever way possible. And I don't know if this political class in itself, the ruling political class, is redeemable at all, but to kind of influence whether the formation of a new government, whether certain decisions that would lead to certain fiscal, economic, and political reforms. But somebody pointed in the chat something significant, which was, it's true that we're lacking solutions here in some ways. Like, we're talking without anything concrete. Like, there are some concrete things that need to happen, which, I mean, starting with, there is a blast that destroyed, 3/4 of the city, and for which there is no independent investigation. There are some concrete things that we can kind of start working on. There are some sort of negative there needs to be more protection for human rights, freedoms, etc., that are being eroded right now. But most importantly, these forces, these pro-democratic forces, need to be supported. And there needs to be this new vision, in my opinion, that takes into account not just Lebanon's place in the Middle East that I pointed, but also the emergence of forces that I realized when I was in Lebanon. They're mostly young, they're idealistic, they have no memory of the war, and I'm talking in relationship to myself, that reacted to different traumas differently than what my generation would react, who want a future for themselves that is democratic, free, secure, economically sound, they want employment, and whose future is being hypothequé, like bankrupt, has been bankrupt by this political class. So you have this reality. I mean, the question is, what do we do with that? You know, to me, the only answer is a combination of support for these internal forces that, you know, I want to be optimistic. And so I want to say, you know, are going somewhere, but also pressure from the outside to hold the political class to account and ensure that there is a roadmap, whatever it is. I'm honest with you, it's difficult to envision, you know, that has the US involved. And I do think, I mean, you asked me this question about how the US should position itself. I think there needs to be a principled approach to support of local forces that have a vision for the better, that is inclusive and democratic. And we should not shy away from that.
And it fits right into the Biden administration posture as well. Rhonda.
I mean, look, how do you get people to change behavior, you know? And the French initiative basically is saying, okay, I'm going to change your behavior, or I'm going to incentivize change by putting so much money on the table. And yet we have seen that has not worked, right? So positive incentives for the political class have not worked. They have not seen yet any kind of reforms as being in their interest. And they are, to be very honest, you know, putting myself in their shoes, they are correct in this assessment. Reforms are not going to be in their interest. And so they're going to fight it tooth and nail. And the economic conditions are going to make it easier for them, especially next year, to maintain their power base. You know, as we have talked in the past, vote buying is going to be much cheaper going forward. And so, and these are the parties that have the financial means, and they have the political machinery on top of that to be able to do that. And so there is this then pressure, partly is you know, pushing for some international mechanisms to investigate the blast, which the civil society and the people have been pushing for some time. And it has to be, and I don't think the French endorsed it and the international community endorsed it as much as they should at the time. And the class interpreted as them not having, you know, will to punish them for that. But also the other part is sanctions. You know, we have already used Magnitsky sanctions against some of the politicians. And I think that sanctions should be part of the menu of actions and measures that the Biden administration need to think about. And maybe it should be the first item in the menu going forward. And sanctions not only targeting parties that are opposed to the US, but parties that have been pro-US, because everybody in that political class is corrupt. Everybody worked together to bring the country over decades into the dismal state of affairs that they are in. And so that's another thing. I mean, and I think it is in the report, sanctions should be, you know, should be taken, and not only by the Americans. So it's very important that the international community, especially the Western community, sends a consistent message to the politician. As long as, for example, France is not sanctioning these politicians, I think they will feel that they have a way out. There need to be a consistent, unanimous message, and sanctions should be part of that. And the EU and the French and the GCC should be basically on board with sanction, again, different of the, you know, officials, but also across the political spectrum, and to send the message, and that would be interpreted also by the population, by civil society, as a message of support.
Rhonda, very, very eloquently said and well said. I mean, we obviously talk about sanctions in the paper, and we do see it as an instrument of US policy, as long as it's not targeting individuals or sects. It's targeting individuals, not parties or sects. So we agree with that. It goes along with the corruption issue, repatriation of capital flight, and the rest. We're at the end of our time. I want to thank everyone, Paul, Rhonda, Patricia, and Jacques, for participating. Thanks to all of you who sent in questions. We appreciate them. I hope we got addressed some high percentage of them. Remember, if you want to copy the report, you go to www.mei.edu or www.atfl.org for the actual report. It's only 4 pages. It's a policy brief. And as I said, don't forget tomorrow, if you want to look at the economy and what's happening to Lebanon, MEI has a program. You can just go onto their website and there's a registration site for it. Thank you all. I want to thank Life. I want to thank MEI for joining in this very important effort. Obviously, as always with Lebanon, it's a beginning. It's not an end to anything. And let's hope that, I don't want to say inshallah or bismillah, that US policy can make a difference, and we will be joining with our partners to continue this fight. We ask all of you, as Congressman Lahoud said, to help with the advocacy and education that we have to have in order to have a good, solid, helpful policy from the United States toward Lebanon, and see if the Lebanese respond.